Today is the last in the sequence on monetary valuation, putting a price on something that is not traded on the market. And the applications are, of course, to environmental issues. So I'm going to talk briefly about the principles of stated preference methods. Then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about contingent valuation. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about choice modeling. So this is where we are in the sequence. We're past halfway. No, we're halfway at the break, right? You will have noticed that the essay is exactly on this set of methods, right? Regardless of which version of the essay you pick. But let's get going. So, what are stated preference methods? Essentially, what you do is, last week we looked at surrogate markets, where we try to refer somebody's valuation, say, of a park from looking at their travel behavior to that park, or we were looking at the value of a park from the perspective of prospective home buyers willing to buy a house, or how much they are willing to spend extra to live near that desirable park, right? Those are surrogate markets. Today we're going to look at hypothetical markets. And that's where the word stated comes from. So there's two ways of doing so. One is the contingent valuation method, which is the oldest, where essentially you just ask somebody, how much would you be willing to pay for this particular good or service? And the second method goes by a variety of names: choice modeling, choice experiments, where you do not ask the question directly, but you ask the same question indirectly. You give people the choice between good A and good B, where obviously they differ on their environmental qualities, because that's what we're interested in, and obviously they also has to differ on their price. And then you can infer that the price differential and relate or you observe the price differential and relate that to the differential in environmental quality. So those are the two basic ways of doing so. The second method is very much used in marketing. It goes by the name of conjoint analysis. For those of you who come a little bit earlier, the previous lecturer used to work in marketing, and he essentially summarized the whole field as don't believe a word that we say. And I'll come back to that why. The first method is very close to psychology rather than to marketing, and a lot of things that I'll be talking about are more psychological than economic. So that's a brief preview. The main advantage of stated preference methods is that you can ask this question about anything and about everything. Last week we looked at revealed preference methods, and one main drawback is that you can only apply them really to direct use values. You cannot ask about existence values or bequest values, option values, a little bit, quasi option values are basically out of the question. But really, the reason that you go travel someplace is because you go out and enjoy yourself there, right? Not because you think that your children might enjoy this or your friends might enjoy this, right? No, you go there because you like it. So it's very much restricted to direct use values. Whereas, because we're putting people in a hypothetical situation, you can ask about anything, right? Including about things that do not exist. And there have indeed been studies about the value of fairies and the value of trolls, depending on the country you're in. And even though these things do not really exist, people are really, or at least saying that they're really willing to pay something to help protect fairies in Ireland and trolls in Norway. Another advantage of a hypothetical market is that you as a researcher are in full control over the market, right? You don't need to make any assumptions about market power or about information or anything like that, because you create the market and the market is as you say it is, right? And then that also then implies that you can create hypothetical markets, not just about things today, but also about things in the future. And I referred briefly to marketing, right? One of the things that people in marketing do is come up with a new toothbrush and try to sell that to you, or rather try to gauge your interest in this new toothbrush that does not yet exist or is not yet on the market, right? So that is one of the main strengths. Obviously, we are not interested in selling toothbrushes, but we are interested in future improvements or future deteriorations of environmental quality, right? Not just today's situation. And since we are directly asking people, we are in direct contact with our subjects, we can ask them all sorts of additional questions, questions that you would not see on a Zoopla website, for instance. We can ask people for their voting behavior, we can ask people for their income, we can ask people for all sorts of stuff, as well as we can ask people, why did you just give the answer you gave, right? So we know much more about the people about our subjects than we would know in most revealed preference methods. The two big weaknesses is that in order to do this right, it is very costly. So revealed preference methods, 1 year of postdoc, stated preference methods, because there's so much involved in the design and you have to collect all the data yourself. You're really talking about something that is 3 to 5 times more expensive per estimate. The big problem with stated preference methods is that it's hypothetical. So we're asking people to pay for stuff. Not really. We're asking people how much they would pay for stuff. This is not the same. People are not putting their money where their mouth is. They're just exploring their mouth rather than their behavior. And that essentially means that we make 3 leaps of faith. Obviously, what we're interested in is the actual behavior of real people in a real market. But that is not what we get, right? We do not observe people's choices. We ask them what they would do. So it's intended behavior. But it's also not intended behavior in a real market. It's intended behavior in a hypothetical market. And then, of course, people do not necessarily tell us their intentions. It is what they want us to believe their intentions are in this hypothetical market. So we have 3 leaps of faith. This is what we have, reports of intended behavior in a hypothetical market, and the top actual behavior in a real market is what we would like to have, right? But it is pretty big stuff. 2 weeks ago, I talked briefly about the Deepwater Horizon, that BP platform that exploded, killed a whole bunch of people, and many, many more birds and fish. And the damages that were awarded against British Petroleum by the courts in the United States were based on contingent valuation studies. And later on, I also mentioned Exxon Valdez, right? The Exxon tanker that at that time it was still Exxon, not ExxonMobil. That Exxon tanker that grounded and spilled all of its cargo into the Prince William Sound in 1989, when your father was still a young man. Also, the damages awarded against Exxon were based on contingent valuation studies. And I'll come back to some of those in a half hour, maybe a little bit longer. So it's big stuff. So let's look at contingent valuation first. And essentially the question here is, how much would you pay for this good, right? Or for this service? What you do in a contingent valuation is a whole bunch of things. You first research the background of what you're valuing. Then you decide on how to survey people, what population to target, and how to target, how to get to a representative sample of that population. Then you design your survey, you test it, and you find that your survey is not very good, so you redesign it, and you go through a couple of loops until you're happy. Then you hire and train your interviewers, you do a field pilot, and then it turns out that your survey is not very good. So you redesign it, then you actually start asking the questions for real, you collect the data, you analyze the data, you test and test and test and test. And then finally in step 13, you actually come up with a real number. What is our estimate of the population's willingness to pay for what we're interested in? And then you write it up and present and evaluate it. It is quite a lengthy process. The surveys typically look something as follows. You begin by asking or telling people about the issue that you're interested in. And at the same time, so you're saying we're interested in doing something about the sewage problem in our coastal waters, right? Let's pick a current topic. So that is how you start. You say you have to tell people this is what it is about. And then you ask people, so what do you think about this, and how satisfied are you with the current situation? And of course, anybody who has followed the news in this country recently would know that there's a lot of shit being dumped in the rivers and hence into the sea, right? So your expectation would be that people are pretty unsatisfied with this, unless they happen to be Tory MPs. Then they seem to be very, very happy with the current situation. Then you ask also about people's general outlook on life. So I picked a hot political topic. So one of the questions you may follow up is, like, who do you vote for? Are you a member of an environmental NGO? That sort of stuff. What do you think about environmental quality in general? Is this a priority issue for you? And so on and so forth. And you may also ask specific questions, or you may also ask questions about people's knowledge of the situation. How can it be that so much raw sewage ends up in our coastal water, right? And if you follow the debate on this in the public domain, you would know that people have very skewed ideas about whose fault this all is and how come. And that is good to know, because that may actually affect the way they reply to the later question. Then typically as a third part in the survey, you sketch a scenario. And the scenario compares the current situation, lots of shit in the water, to a future situation or a proposed situation where presumably there would be less sewage in the coastal water, right? And then the fourth step is to actually ask So this is the proposal. This is what we're going to do. How much are you willing to pay for this, right? And that question comes in two parts. One, you need to select the payment vehicle. I'll come back to that later. And second, you need to find an elicitation mechanism, right? And then you're going to ask questions about, so why did you answer the way you did? What is your motivation in this? If you said nothing, if there's a protest vote, why did you protest? And so on and so forth. And then at the very end, you ask, are you a boy or a girl or somewhere in between? What is your income? What is your education? And so on and so forth, right? The reason that you put these questions at the end is because people hate answering these questions because partly they're boring, right? Because every survey asks these questions, so people drop out, but also sometimes people do not want to answer because they are offended by the question. And I just said, are you a boy or a girl or somewhere in between? And there's of course also people who are not somewhere in between, right? But are something entirely different, and they may be offended by the way I posed that question. And you don't want people to drop out at the beginning, you want people to drop out at the very end if they are going to drop out, right? Typically, people are offended by this question, what is your income? That is when you see very rapid drop-off. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. The scenario essentially, the problem with a lot of these things, with a lot of these surveys, is that you're asking very strange questions. The one that I just picked, raw sewage in surface waters, is something that anybody who pays attention to the news in England knows about, right? So people there have an idea, but it is important that everybody is sort of on the same informational basis. Because if you just ask the question without sketching the current situation, people may actually completely exaggerate how much sewage there really is in the water, or they may downplay it, right? And you need to sort of put everybody on the same page in as far as possible, because then you're comparing like with like. More typically, however, is that you're trying to value something that not a lot of people have heard of. I may be interested in how much you are willing to pay to reduce the number of antibiotics in surface waters. And then most people would say, are there antibiotics in surface waters? How could they get there? I've never heard of it. Yes, they are, and it's a real problem, but it's not something that is making headlines at the moment, or actually ever has made headlines, but it is an important environmental problem. So you need to put everybody sort of on the same page. And then, of course, the second stage here is that you then suggest a situation that is different in a meaningful way, right? You can use text, you can use figures, photos, maps, video, whatever you like. What is important here, something that is often violated in practice, is that you suggest a credible alternative. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about example of these later. The studies that were used there suggested there's an alternative that double hulled tankers would be used in the future. As well as that all tankers would be accompanied by, would be escorted by emergency response ships, at least when they're near shore. That is a credible intervention. You cannot say we're going to reduce the risk of accidents to zero. That just cannot be. That is just not believable, right? Nor can you say we're going to transport all oil by pipeline. That is also not a credible alternative. Or you could say we're going to stop using oil altogether. That is definitely in 1989 was not a credible scenario. It's a credible sort of for 2060, maybe 2070, but not much before that, right? you give an incredible alternative, then people will not take you very seriously, right? And also, even if they answer, they're willing to pay for something that doesn't exist. You could ask people, how much are you willing to pay for a unicorn, right? Yes, there would be people who are willing to pay for a unicorn, but that doesn't mean that you can buy one ever, right? So that just doesn't help anybody. And of course, people need to be able to interpret what you're telling them, right? So this actually goes back to sewage in water. That is something that people understand, right? There's human waste floating in our rivers. That is, of course, not how natural scientists look at this. They look at the concentration of fecal coliforms in drinking water, right? That is how the experts think about this. But that is not the sort of information you should present. You should say, well, this water would be clean enough to swim in, it would be clean enough to fish from, would be clean enough to sail on. Not clean enough to drink, please. But that is the sort of information that people understand, right? Now, this is a big challenge, a much bigger challenge than many people realize. There's two big challenges here. One is that the people who design the interview or design the survey have just read up all the academic literature on this, right? So they know what 52 mmP fecal coliform per 100 milliliters means, right? But the people who design the survey know much more about the topic than the people who take the survey. That is one problem. And the other problem is that the people who design the survey tend to be much smarter, much more intelligent than the people who take the survey, right? And that is because of the selection process in academia, right? 40% go to university, and of those 40%, around 30% go on and do a master's. And then of that 30% of that 40%, about 30% go off and do a PhD, right? So and typically we select the smarter 30% and the smarter 40% and the smarter 30% to go and do a PhD. And then of course, of those who do a PhD, the ones who actually become researchers is again a fraction of that, right? Again, selection on partly on interest, but also partly on intelligence. The people who design these things are much, much cleverer than the people who take these things, right? And that leads to all sorts of confusion. And that is something that is unfortunately often overlooked. In all this, it is of course also important that you do not lead your subjects. This is about lambs, right? Lambing season. So the lambs will be out in the field soon if you enjoy that. Of course, you should speak about these lambs in a neutral way if the damage is done to their health, not about reminding people how cute they are, right? All very important and sometimes overlooked. And there is a trade-off here, right? Because you want people to engage with your subject, so you don't want to be too neutral, and you want people to understand what you're talking about. So you want to use clear language. So that is difficult to pull off. Also, the amount of information that you give about the current situation is difficult. If you just ask people without giving them any information, you can get any answer. But the more information you feed people, the less representative they become, right? If you start your survey with a 5-minute lecture on the subject, then that means that your respondents know 5 minutes more about the subject than the general population, right? So it is, these things are difficult to get right, and there's no hard and fast rules. It's just that you should pay attention to what you're doing. Be very careful. The choice of payment vehicle is also terribly important. And this is not a question how much people are willing to pay, but how they are gonna pay. And there's a whole range of choices there. You can fund this from general taxation, right? The question is not how much are you willing to pay, but the question is how much would you want to see your taxes go up in order to finance this project, right? That would be an appropriate question. Now, the problem with taxation is that it really depends on where you are, how people respond to taxes. Nobody likes taxes that much, but Europeans tend to be much more tolerant of higher taxes than Americans are, right? So that is an important distinction. Also, if you're going to finance this out of income taxes, you I don't pay income tax. I'm a student, right? So I wouldn't mind taxes to go up, right? It would be a bit of a silly answer from you guys, because in 2 years' time you're in the job market, right? And you will pay income tax. But if you ask pensioners, right, they don't pay income tax. And they would give a different answer than the general population, right? So keep that in mind. Another way of financing things is, I mean, we were talking about sewage in surface water, would be for your utility bills to go up, right? That would be one way of financing this. What does not work for sewage is raising an entrance fee. Again, this way sort of like seem neutral, right? That this park used to be free for everybody to enter, and now we're gonna levy an entrance fee, and that is how we're gonna finance the improvements to the park. That may seem like a fair way of doing things, because the user would pay in this case, right? Only the people who directly use it would contribute. So that seems fair, and you cannot see that people would protest against this. But of course, as soon as you raise the issue of an entrance fee that suggests that it will be a gate, and that suggests that it will be fences to keep those people out that do not pay entrance fees, so that sort of injects into the minds of the people who respond to the survey a certain image of how this is going to be done, and that may affect the answer that they give, right? So be careful there. Similarly for parking charges, right? The user pays, so this may be a good idea. But of course, people who walk or cycle to the site, or who take the bus, would not pay the parking charge, right? So the payments fall on certain people, but not on others. So again, what we need to do here is just be careful, test and test again to see that you indeed, through your choice of payment vehicle, do not affect the answers that you get, or affect the answers in such a way that you can control things, right? If you're going to use a parking charge, then you should also ask people, how did you get here? And presumably discount the answers from people who come cycling, right? Very important, is this a one-off payment? Is this a recurrent payment? Is it a payment per month, or is it a payment per year? Those things are important for the interpretation. Another important thing to keep in mind here is that these payments are not voluntary. These are not contributions to charity. And the reason that you do not want to make them voluntary is because of the problems of the private provision of a public good that we talked about before. So that is how people would pay. Now, how do you get an answer? The answer, or the option that I've used so far, is an open-ended question. how much are you willing to pay for reducing sewage in surface water, raw sewage in surface water? That is one option. Problem is that you're asking a very strange question. This is not such a strange question, but you could also ask, how much are you willing to pay to help save the whales or dolphins? People have no clue, right, what that means. Going back to the previous lecture, there have been surveys of people in parking lots near supermarkets asking people, how much are you willing to pay for toilet paper? Including people who just came out of the supermarket with a trolley full of toilet paper. Toilet paper is big, right? So it easily fills up a trolley. And the answers that they gave were all over the place. Because even though they had just 5 minutes previous paid for toilet paper, they actually have no clue what toilet paper costs. So even for sort of like those things that we buy regularly, all of us, people have a very vague idea of how much things really cost. And now you're walking up to them and say, how much are you going to pay for a whale? Like, what sort of question is that? How am I possibly able to answer that question, right? Now, there are sort of things we buy regularly, and therefore people should be calibrated reasonably well, but are not. If you're talking about big one-off purchases like a whale or like car insurance, then what people typically do is they don't just walk up and buy car insurance. No, they ask their friends and they ask their family and they look at price comparison websites and so on and so forth about how much this would cost, right? And how the different packages compare. And after studying, some people study an hour, some people take 3 weeks, they make a decision, right? That is how we do these things. But if somebody walks up to you in the street and say, how much are you willing to pay for, and sort of expect you to give an answer within the next 10 seconds, that is not a format where you can expect reasonable answers, right? So, one option to make it easier is to offer them a menu, essentially, what is known as a payment letter or a payment card, where you say, well, these are prices to pick one, right? Another option is to put it in referendum format. Are you willing to pay £50 per year? Yes or no? And sometimes to do a follow-up. You said you are willing to pay £50. Are you also willing to pay £100 per year? Or if you said no to the first question, are you willing to pay £25 per year for this particular thing? That is something that people have a much better feel about, right? The problem, of course, is that you don't have very precise information. You essentially have yes, no, rather than 75 or 52, right? So you need a lot more, that's what is going on here. You need a lot more data. You need a lot more people that you interview to get a reasonable answer. So let's look at a case study where these things become a little bit more concrete. We're going to go to Stonehenge. This is a study that was done by an old friend of mine, David Madison, now at Birmingham University. And the interview or the survey is not about Stonehenge. It is about the roads around the Stonehenge, right? So this is the current situation. We have the car park, the visitor center, And there you have Stonehenge, right? And it's pretty ugly, right? And not Stonehenge itself, but from Stonehenge, you're looking at the car park and you're looking at the visitor center, and it's all not good. So the proposal is as follows, that you stick this road here, and you stick it on the ground, and the other roads, the 303, that is up there, you essentially take away the tarmac and say, okay, horses can go there and hikers, and that's it. And then the experience, if you are in Stonehenge, is much more a green environment rather than loads of cars and noise around, right? So that is a way to suggest a scenario, right? Current situation, this is what Stonehenge looks now, and this is what we would like Stonehenge to be like. You need to describe that this whole thing is going to cost this somewhat older study is going to cost 125 million. Of course, one of the problems is that nowadays you can just drive on those roads, the 303, and see Stonehenge without having to stop, right? Bunch of old stones, right? So you can just drive by and wave at it, and then you've seen it. Is my opinion. But that would be a loss as well. There's benefits, less congestion of people slowing down to see Stonehenge, right? So time savings, fewer accidents, because people are looking at Stonehenge rather than paying attention on the road. Less noise, the amenity of Stonehenge itself would improve, the landscape would reunify to be all nice and green. The scenario is shown in pictures as well as in text. And then you ask, which option do you prefer? The old situation or the current situation or the proposed situation, right? A simple yes, no. And then the willingness to pay question was asked as follows. A tax that was time limited over the next 2 years. So students in their second year could say, yeah, tax, right? I'm not paying taxes. I'm going to vote for this. And the format that was used was the so-called payment letter, right? Where you were given, they were given options of not willing to pay anything up to more than £200 per year for 2 years, right? And then people simply say yes until one point and then no for the rest, right? So that is how a payment letter looks like. Problem with payment letters is, of course, that you have anchoring bias. What you suggest as soon as you put this up is that 200 is sort of the maximum any reasonable person would ever want to pay for this, right? But the way to get around this is to split your sample into 3, and you give some people 100 as a maximum, some people 200 as a maximum, and some people 400 as a maximum, and then see whether it is, right? And typically it does, because the way people shop, or the way a lot of people shop, is that they use a heuristic, right? Depending on where they are. If they're snobs, they go for the most expensive option. If they're poor students, they go for the cheapest option. But many people would say, I'll take the middle one because that is the right choice, right? So if you walk into a supermarket and you see a range of products at different prices, then a lot of people sort of go for the middle one, right? So as soon as you sort of like give them a menu, you affect their behavior, right? And then there were a bunch of follow-up questions. My household cannot afford to pay. That's why I said 0. Or I quite like the roads around Stonehenge. That's why I'm not willing to pay. I think that we should solve homelessness rather than tunnel roads around Stonehenge, right? Or a silly position. I think the government should pay for this, or if the government is money, right? It doesn't. The government levies taxes, and that's how things are paid for. And also protest votes like taxes are high enough as they are, right? So therefore, I will object to this. Actually, in this particular study, 55% prefer the status quo. They were nonetheless, it's a bit surprising, nonetheless willing to pay £2.69p per year for this. Of those who actually do prefer to put the vote in a tunnel, their willingness to pay was around £9 per year. And their main motivation was that they want to make sure that Stonehenge will survive for another. Stonehenge is 7,000 years old, for another 7,000 years or so, right? Then if you add it all up, then the people were willing to pay about the total population, right? And scale it all up to people who live in the United Kingdom. Total willingness to pay was around 180 million. But there was also the 66 million who would like to things as they are, which leads to a total benefit of 114. And the cost, you may recall, was 125. So the result was don't do this, and poor David was very unpopular as a result. Because of course the ministry, the department that commissioned this study had hoped for overwhelming support for their plan, but that is not what the study found. So how credible are these studies? What can go wrong? I've hinted at something, but there's many more things that can go wrong. And there's various ways of testing or various ways of discussing the validity or the robustness of results. And here you're looking at some classification there. The first one is face validity. It doesn't make any sense what we're doing here. The important one that often goes wrong is construct validity. Does it matter what does it measure what it intends to measure? And the Stonehenge study is actually a good example of this, because the media at that time argued that Stonehenge is worth 140 million. But that is not what the study was about at all. It was not about a scenario with and without Stonehenge. It was about a scenario with and without roads around Stonehenge, right? And a lot of people misinterpret this. And not just the media, but presumably also some of the people who responded to the survey, right? I'll get back to content validity when I talk about docs after the break. Does it measure all of the things that we're interested in, or only part? Or does it measure other things that the survey designers did not have in mind at all? So that is important to keep an eye on. Criterion validity is about, do we actually accurately measure what we're interested in measuring? And there's two things there. One is convergent validity. If we compare our estimates to estimates of similar things, do we get a reasonably similar answer, or is it all over the place, right? So that is an important criterion. The other is divergent validity, and I'll come back to that after the break as well. We always get the same answer regardless of what we ask. That would be a problem, right? If people always say 50 pounds, regardless of the question you ask them. And then, because we're academics, it's also important to check that things are actually consistent. And in the duck example, I'm gonna give you when I talk about ducks, I'm gonna give you a counter example. And then finally, test and retest validity. If we go back a year later, value the same thing in the same way, do we get a similar answer, right? Is important here. The most persistent criticism of contingent valuation is that it's hypothetical. Because you're asking people what they would pay rather than what they do pay, no reason for them to give a truthful or accurate answer. And this can be quite strong. There was one test done where they were doing a contingent valuation study of entrance to a castle. And they were interviewing people who had just parked their car and were walking up to the castle, wondering whether or not to go and have a look inside or a look in the gardens. And they asked people a whole bunch of questions, and then the question, so how much are you willing to pay as an entrance fee to the grounds or to the castle? And people gave answers, blah, 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 £2, £1.50 per person, £3 per person, something like that. And then they asked further questions. How did you get here? What party did you travel in? What is your income? Do you vote Tory? And so on and so forth. And then at the very end of the interview, they actually turned around and say, in the willingness to pay question, of course, that's not how they phrased it. You said you were willing to pay £2 as an entrance fee. Have your entrance ticket, and it's going to cost you the price you just quoted at £2. 43% of respondents took that offer. And that means that 57% said, yeah, I just told you £2. I'm not willing to pay that really. And some had a valid reason, right? They said, yeah, I'm really willing to pay £2, but I'm looking at a place and it's much bigger than I thought, so I'm going to come back tomorrow when I have more time, right? That's a valid answer. Or somebody said, yeah, I'm really willing to pay £2 to look in the grounds, but there's this rain cloud there, and I'm going to come back a day when the sun is shining, right? Those are valid reasons. But other people say, I told you £2, but that was not really what I meant, right? A bit of a cheapskate. That's of course not what people say of themselves, right? So yes, you do get really hypothetical answers sometimes. Now there's ways around this, and essentially you want to take away sort of the immediacy of the answer. You want to give people time to think. So one thing that used to be popular is the so-called drop-off protocol, that you post a survey to people, like not online stuff, not interviewing people over the phone, or things like that, but do it by mail, and then they have time to think about this. Or if you do a phone interview, then you say, well, I'm going to ask the question now, but I'm going to call you back tomorrow when you have time to ponder the answer, right? So that is one way around it, and also popular are so-called cheap talk scripts, which is essentially saying, yes, it's hypothetical, but you should really pretend it is not hypothetical, and please, 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 please do so. And here you see an example of that. It doesn't take away the fact that you put people in a hypothetical market and they're not putting money on the table, right? So this is a good time to break. After the break, we're going to reconvene at 2. After the break, I'm going to talk more about potential biases and contingent valuation, and I'm going to talk about contingent choice, which takes away some of your concerns, but certainly not all. Okay, I see you guys in 10. What other things can go wrong with contingent valuation. There's actually a whole lot that can go wrong. Talked about protest votes already a little bit. And some people may just object to the tax implied in the survey, right? And they say they actually care about Stonehenge and the roads around Stonehenge. They just don't want to pay more tax, right? So that is one option. I'm not going to talk about the difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. I'm going to do that next term. Standard behavior in hypothetical markets, you're not asking people to put their money where their mouth is. So some people cop on to that. Some respondents realize that that is what is going on. So somebody walks up to you and say, how much are you willing to pay to clean up sewage in the surface water, right? And you realize that you're not being asked to pay. You know that this is a tax that's going to be spread over the entire population. And you know that they're going to interview 1,000 people and that your answer is going to be averaged with the 999 others, right? So if you care about the subject, then you should not state your willingness to pay, but you should give a much higher number because your high bid will be averaged out anyway, and you want the government to pay more, right? So a rational response, if you really care about this, is to give a much higher number than your true willingness to pay, right? Or, of course, if you think they're all hippies and Wokarati and whatever, you're going to say zero, right? Even if you care, you know that there's enough people out there that care more than you do and are happy to spend your money, so you're going to give a lower answer. So people sort of like see the game that is being played and act strategically. Definitely, if you have an open-ended question, then it is open to self-manipulation. If it's a dichotomous choice, 50 pounds, yes, no, then there's much less scope for actually affecting the result, right? Skip that to the end. Interviewer bias may be important, maybe very important. And definitely if you're doing face-to-face interviews or telephone interviews. But even then, even if not, it may affect results. I used to teach this much more extensively way back when I was in Hamburg, and we had an entire term on valuation first, and then we did an entire term on actually doing valuation, right? Where I send out students to actually do a contingent valuation study. And then when we analyzed the results, the only thing that turned out to be significant in our regression was the interviewer ID, right? Everything else was insignificant. And the only thing that determined the result was who had asked the questions. And this was a face-to-face interview, so not entirely unsurprising. Those things happen. You can imagine you're out on the street, a pretty girl walks up to you and asks you, how much are you willing to pay to help protect whales? And the straight males amongst you will think, she's interested in protecting whales, right? I'm going to impress her by giving a high number, much higher than I'm actually willing to pay, right? That is how the male mind works. And you see that often. You can also imagine a scenario when another pretty girl walks up to you, but somebody with bad breath, right? Then your answer is, go away, I'm not willing to pay anything, right? These things matter, and they matter much more than you might think. An old friend of mine paid part of her way through college by doing these surveys. One of the surveys was about the mathematical abilities of immigrants in the Netherlands. And she went to their houses and she made them solve pretty simple mathematical problems. She began to feel sorry for some of them and helped them. This, of course, was not a true measure of their mathematical ability. Another infamous example is this interviewer who was involved in a survey about the prevalence of AIDS, HIV/AIDS in Kenya. Believe it or not, as part of the survey, the respondents were asked to donate blood. Imagine, right? Somebody walks up to your door and asks all sorts of questions. How rich are you? And blah, 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 blah. And what is your sexual behavior? And do you take drugs? And all those sort of questions that you do not really want to discuss with strangers. And then they ask you to donate blood as well, right? Yeah, pretty intrusive survey. So there's two interviewers that stood out. One did not really want to ask for blood and donated his own blood. And they discovered this because in one part of the survey, everybody had AIDS, right? Interviewer had AIDS. Another interviewer was a bit smarter and he took blood from a cow rather than from the people he interviewed. And of course, that was also discovered because the DNA wasn't quite human, right? But those things happen, right? Interviewer bias is terribly important. Related to the example of the pretty girl and the bad breath is the yay saying, nay saying behavior. Some people, if they're asked the question, are you willing to pay for this, say yes, because it's in their nature to agree with whomever they're talking to. Other people are the exact opposite, right? They say no to everything, right? And that happens. Part of the pretty girl example, prominence bias, right? So people may not be interested in the subject at all, and then they're being prompted by this interviewer about these questions, about this topic, right? So they must think, or they may think that this must be important. I have never thought of it as important, but because this person keeps asking me questions about it, that must mean because I am wrong. And it is actually very important, right? I talked about information bias, right? That you give information to the people in your sketch of the scenarios, and that means that their knowledge is no longer representative. Also important is the non-response bias. So there's many ways of doing an interview, right? One is walking up to somebody in the street. Then, of course, you only find those people who happen to be on the street at that time, right? Which is not a representative part of the population. You may call people up at home. Then, of course, you only have a directory of landlines, right? So you get those people with landlines, which is not a representative part of the population. And you only get those people who happen to be at home at the time that you call them, which also makes for a non-representative sample, right? And of course, there's always people who say no to any interview request, right? And those tend to be the busier and sometimes better informed and richer parts of the population who tend to decline the opportunity to answer any question, right? So there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. Online surveys are very popular nowadays, but of course you only get the people who are internet savvy. That is, your grandmother and grandfather are probably not among them, right? So there's all sorts of problems here. You can solve that by weighing the results. So these are just things that can go wrong in any interview with regard to any subject. The thing that I want to spend a little bit more time on is the whole issue of part-hole bias to sequencing and adding up. I talked about the starting point bias and anchoring already. And that came out of the Exxon Valdez studies. So, as I said, in 1989, this big oil tanker by Exxon ran aground in the Prince William Sound in Alaska. Big oil spill, and the question was how much damage should Exxon, not yet Exxon Mobil, how much damage should Exxon pay? And as part of that, the people who took Exxon to court issued a bunch of contingent valuation studies that quantified the damage. And two of the people that I showed the picture before, Richard Carson and Mike Hanneman, were actually deeply involved in that. And then the defense, Exxon, also commissioned their own studies that showed everything that can go wrong in contingent valuation study, right? And they hired one Nobel laureate and two would-be Nobel laureates to lead this study for them. And the most striking evidence against this came out of a study about ducks in Louisiana. Hausman and Diamond did this study, and they followed the state-of-the-art in contingent valuation, and it was all about Louisiana, where there's oil exploitation, and as a result of all this, there's essentially pools of oil at the surface, right, where they just dump the waste oil that they have, and they're just pools, and it's all pretty ugly. But it is Louisiana, so there's a lot of migratory birds, particularly migratory duck and geese that fly over there, and these are pretty stupid animals. They cannot tell the difference between a pool of water and a pool of oil. So they just land in the oil, and as a result, they get covered in oil and die eventually, right? A pretty slow and painful death. So that was the situation that they described. And then they described an alternative scenario where there would be nets over the oil pools so that the ducks could not get into the oil and would happily fly to a place where there was actually water, right? So far, so standard. And then they asked people about their willingness to pay for this program. But the tricky thing, or the thing that they did was that they split the sample in three, and in one part of the sample, the program would save 30,000 ducks. In one part of the sample, the program would save 300,000 ducks, and in one part of the sample, they would save 3 million ducks. And lo and behold, the answer that people gave was the same. So people were willing to pay the same for saving 30,000 ducks as for 3 million ducks. And of course, Hausman and Diamond drew the conclusion that contingent valuation is all nonsense, because obviously, if you're going to save 100 times more ducks, you should be willing to pay 100 times as much. Or at least you should be willing to pay more, right? That's basic, that's consistent with theory, right? If you get more, you should be willing to pay more. That is known as the part-whole bias, right? It's also known as embedding and known as scope in sensitivity. You also see that temporally, that if you ask people how much are you willing to pay per year, they give the same answer as when you ask them how much are you willing to pay per month. Now, obviously, you should be willing to pay 12 times as much per year as you are per month, right? But that is not how people answer these questions. It also pops up in sequencing that you ask first about a small thing and then about a bigger thing, and then you expect different results, but you do not necessarily get them. Now, this is a big problem, right? And there are various interpretations of this. None of which are entirely satisfactory. The one interpretation is that people do not really answer the question, but answer in a warm glow sort of way. So this the way to picture this is as follows. You just want to live your life, right? You don't want to think about all the misery in the world. You do know that there's misery in the world, and you want to be a good person, and you want to contribute to solving this. So you do pay something to charity, and you may have set an annual budget of donations to charity of say £500, right? And that is what you made up at the start of the year. This is how much I'm going to donate to charity this year. You also recall that last year 10 people asked you for a contribution. So you put those two facts together, and what you're going to do is you're going to give £50 to the first 10 charities that come and ask for your contribution. And then maybe the 11, maybe number 12, you say no, right? That is how you may have made this decision, right? And this allows you to do good without being sort of bogged down and getting depressed by all the misery in the world, right? You just give them £50 and then they shut up and go away. Now, if that is how people see these surveys, something good for the environment, here's £50, I go back to watching Stranger Things on telly, right? Because I'm more, or I go back to studying for my exams, of course, what you guys should be doing. If that is how people interpret these surveys, then it doesn't matter whether you say $30,000 or $3 million, right? What matters is that they convinced you that this is a good cause, and your standard answer is £50, right? Now, this is known technically as warm glow giving, because really you're not buying the environmental good or service. What you're buying is the ability to feel good about yourself, self-satisfaction, or at least the ability not to feel bad about yourself that you never contribute to charity. If that is people's motivation for giving, it really doesn't matter what question you ask, because you always get this answer, right? And then you can also ask questions about fairies or about trolls, right? People have this and they don't want to know about this, right? They just give you some money to go away and shut up, and then they can go and tell their friends, I contributed to charity today, ain't I good? Or maybe they're the introvert sort of person, they think of themselves as good, right? Without telling others. So that is one interpretation. And of course, it completely destroys the whole purpose of contingent valuation, right? That what you're getting is not people's willingness to pay for the environmental good or service. What you're getting is the general donation. The other interpretation goes back to the work of including some people here at Sussex, Pavel Pavel, right? The guy who taught you maths, the Polish guy. And that is that people can't count. And we probably heard on the news that there was this demonstration in London and 1.1 million people were there. And you wonder, like, how would they know that there were 1.1 million people there? Like, how do they count, right? I can sort of like figure out that after a while, yeah, if you're a specialist in this, you know how many people fit in a square meter, and you know sort of from pictures from the helicopter how much space they filled up. So they have a rough idea of how they did it, but it's actually pretty hard to count to 1.1 million people, right? And we care about people. How do you count ducks? Tell the difference between 100 ducks and 1,000 ducks. You can tell the difference between 1 duck and 2 ducks and 6 ducks, right? That is pretty obvious. But as soon as you have a lot of ducks, it's actually very hard to tell the difference between 30,000 and 300,000 ducks, because there's just lots of them, right? And ducks we don't really care about that much. So it may just be that people count ducks as 1, 2, 6 many, right? And 30,000 isn't many, and 3 million isn't many, and therefore it is the same to people, right? That sort of restored, yeah, we're actually contributing to the preservation of ducks. But still, sort of the standard micro that you are willing to pay more for getting more sort of falls apart, right? Because essentially your demand curve just goes flat, right? There's no change in quantity, and therefore also no change in price. So that also has major ramifications, right? So there's a million things that can go wrong in these studies. Now, this is known, right? I mean, this field is 50 years old or so. So people have been beating each other over the head about these problems for a long time, and gradually making progress, and we definitely know how not to do it. But yeah, whenever you see such a study, you should be very careful in interpreting. If you're ever going to do such a study, it should be very carefully designed and tested and tested and tested again until you're happy, right? But unfortunately, it is sort of the only method, together with the one I'm going to talk about for the next 25 minutes, to estimate the values that are not direct use, right? So the main alternative to contingent valuation is so-called choice modeling. And that it takes away some of the hypothetical market that is in contingent valuation. And come to think of it, contingent valuation is very strange. It's very unusual. Because that's not how we make choices, right? When you buy a second-hand car, you go look, you go talk to your friends, you go talk to your family, you go look on websites, you may visit a couple of dealerships, and so on and so forth, and that is how you make up your mind. You never ask yourself the question, and you never ask the question, how much are you willing to pay for a 10-year-old Ford Escort with 70,000 miles on the clock? That is just not a question that ever occurs in real life, right? Almost never. What you do is you go look at a range of options, and then you make your choice from that range of options. That is the sort of purchasing behavior that we are used to. And because we're used to it, we may be relatively good at it, right? Things that we have never practiced, we tend to be bad at, right? So this is an example a few years ago of what you would see on Amazon if you would be looking for a new smartphone, right? What you see is a range of prices. You see a range of brands, some that you may trust, some that you think you've never heard of. You see different pictures, right? Maybe you like blonde and you think, oh, this may be the better choice. You may actually compare the characteristics, the cameras, the memory, the speed, connectivity, and all these things. And you look at that, and then you make your choice. That is how we have practiced making choices, right? The blonde, of course, does not come with a camera, right? So that would be a silly basis for making choices, but people do respond to that. Now, contingent choice essentially does the same thing, right? And rather than talk about it in an abstract sense, let's look at a real example. And this was done by what was done at what was then called the Department of the Environment, Food, the Regions, DEFRA. And A as well, I don't know what the A stands for. And essentially people were asked, were shown this thing, right? And they had to choose between A, B, C, and D, right? So it was about windmills, where should they be built, near shore, within 1 kilometer of the shore, 4 kilometers out, or they should be built onshore, right? This would increase your electricity bill. This is a while ago, right? That we worried about numbers like this. 80 pounds, 80 pounds, or 40 pounds, right? Talking about credibility, right? It's more expensive, guys. Near shore wind turbines are cheaper than far shore turbines. But here it says both 80. And then where is it built, right? So it was, I said it was done by DEFRA, but obviously only thanks to Scotland. And we got to built out there, right? Or in the south west of Scotland, or onshore on the, really? On the east coast of Scotland, right? This is, I said, really, there's not a lot of wind here. The wind comes from the ocean, right? So the wind is on this side of Scotland, not on this side of Scotland, but this is where they said they would build it. And then in the middle, not really visible, right? Did you spot that? There's also a row about wildlife impact, negative, positive, negative. And then from these three, you were asked to choose. You prefer this option, you prefer this option, or this option. Or do you say, oh, don't want extra wind, we want new gas, coal, and oil, right? So this is how it was really done. And I've already given you some criticism here, right? Wildlife impact, right? I mean, location is pretty clear, right? That this is important because it has a big picture. The visual intrusion is also pretty clear, right? Wildlife, I mean, you actually have to look closely to notice that that is there. So obviously, whoever designed this did not think that wildlife is very important, and presumably a lot of the people who responded to the survey did not notice differences in wildlife impact. I also talked about the credibility of some of the numbers that you see there, right? And people in the know, right? If somebody would send this survey to me, I happen to know my electricity market and I happen to know my renewables, would say, well, this is just ridiculous, right? It cannot be that offshore, far offshore is the same cost as nearshore. Oh, wait. This is actually wait. I did not. Oh, wave energy. Really, guys? Wave energy is so much more expensive than wind energy. No way they could do this, right? But that is essentially how it is done, right? And this is just a bad example. So what do we have? We have 4 different options or alternatives, right? That is what you see in the columns, and there must be always an option, none of the above, right? You cannot force people to choose. They can also always say, I prefer the status quo over whatever alternative you. Then you have a bunch of attributes. How close it is to the shore, how visible is it for people walking the coast, living on the coast. That is something that you need to. Okay, here we have far. So what we do have is that far wind is more expensive than near wind, 120 versus 80. But we also have that way far away from the coast is cheaper than way closer to the coast. It doesn't make any sense because your cables are longer and your waves are smaller. Guys. And we have attributes, right? Things that determine your choice. And an important thing in there, because otherwise you have no information whatsoever about willingness to pay, is that there has to be some sort of price comparison, right? In this case, the payment vehicle is electricity bills. And that's what it is, right? So once you have all this information, essentially what you can then do is say, well, how much does the willingness to pay explain, or how much does the listed price explain how likely it is that people pick this option, right? So there is your willingness to pay measure. And of course, how much does the difference in environmental quality explain the probability that somebody is picking this option, right? So you have a difference in environmental quality and you have a difference in price, and then together they imply a demand curve, right? Together they imply a willingness to pay, right? Now you can see that the econometrics here is getting a little bit hairy, right? But it's not a problem that is insurmountable. The good thing about this is, as I said, this is how we usually make choices. So presumably like this. You're just asking fairly neutral questions. Would you prefer the status quo? Would you prefer this? Would you prefer that? So it's much more difficult for the interviewee to infer what the interviewer wants, right? So there's no way here to impress whoever is interviewing you, or just to agree with whatever they suggest, right? Because it's very unclear what they actually want. So that is good. The other good thing is that these willingness to pay, the contingent valuation, the willingness to pay question is very much on the nose, right? It's very much, and now we're going to ask for your money. So that is at the front of the whole thing, and that leads to a lot of people being insulted by the fact that what you're trying to do is sell nature, right? People don't realize that money is a means of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account, right? No, people see it, well, you want the price of something, that means that you're going to sell it, right? And there's a lot of sort of antagonism towards that. Whereas here, yeah, price is just one of the things, right? It's not front and center in the survey. Of course, it's front and center in the people interpreting the survey, but the interviewees do not know that. And therefore, it would draw much fewer protests. The problem, of course, is that because cost is not front and center, paying attention to the cost at all, right? And just focusing, I live here, so these are the better options, right? Or are those pictures? They may actually, their eye may not be drawn to the price at all, right? And it may actually not explain much. And people use all sorts of ways of responding to surveys like this. It is actually quite cognitively demanding for people to answer questions like this. And of course, everybody has to answer 4 or 5. Everybody's showing 4 or 5 of these cards, right? So you get some variation in answers. So people go for all sorts of, people are inherently lazy. And definitely if you ask them to make a choice that isn't real, then really, why should I bother to think about this, right? I'd rather think about what I'm going to make for dinner tonight, or how I'm going to do my homework, or something like that, right? That is what people mind focus on. People tend to think about the important things rather than answering surveys. So what you often see is if you do things like this, then they always go for the middle option, or they always go for the right option, or they think, well, if I do that, I'm going to be detected and thrown out, so I'm going to left, right, left, right, left, right. That is how I'm going to make my choices, right? That's what people do. Or they may just say, I'm going to look at one attribute only, right? I'm going to only focus on the location, but not care about anything else. And that is what happens in these studies. And then, as you may have guessed, actually, these things are a bit more difficult to analyze than what you would get in Introduction to Statistics. So, to wrap up, this is a study using contingent choice. This was published by the guy who used to teach this course, George McCarran. And essentially they asked people willingness to pay for carbon offsets and the certification certification of those offsets for people flying, right? So whenever you book a flight, you are given the option with most airlines to buy a carbon offset that would sort of negate the CO2 emissions that your flight generates, or so they want you to believe. I would not necessarily believe that if I were you. And therefore there is a lot of certification of those carbon offsets. And if I were you, I would not believe that certification either, but that is me. So they were given these choices, carbon offset, yes, yes, no, additional benefits. So these things do not just suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, but they also help development, or they help preserve orangutans or something. And then they were also interested in the certification. The no certification, what is just the airline claiming it, or what is certified by the UK government, and then obviously price differences as well. And again, credibility, George, certification apparently came at no cost. So people were being asked to do that sort of stuff. And then you run a budget. I'm not going to talk about what mixed budget is, but it allows for heterogeneity in taste. And then they did this follow-up survey as well, why people gave the answer that they gave, right? So going back, I was a bit quick here. That 2.776 is the increase in probability that somebody would pick this option. So yes, and it is definitely significantly different. Zero and positive. So people are prepared to pay more for a carbon offset than has been certified, because they don't trust the ones that have not been certified. So there is a real market here. And then they did this follow-up survey why we would do this, right? Why they are willing to pay for the certification. These are some of the results that they found. It's an emergency, we must act. It's about climate change after all. If I don't do my bit, I can't blame others for not doing theirs when the ice cap melts. One motivation for offsets. And we must fight for the penguins, even though penguins are not really at risk of climate change. It's the polar bears that are typically thought to be at risk. But this person was confusing polar bears and penguins. Polar bears, by the way, also not really at risk of climate change. So that is the reason why people said this. Also, other people said, no, we should not be doing this because it sounds like a scam. And recent news indeed shows that most of these carbon offsets are indeed scams rather than schemes to reduce CO2 emissions. Good schemes for making money, but not so good for reducing climate change. One completely misinterpreted the whole thing. We must fly more to do more good, right? You disgust me. George is a very nice guy. This was a completely unfair comment. These carbon offsets, essentially, when you fly to Barcelona for your holiday, you emit 7 kilograms of CO2, say. What these carbon offsets then do, if they're proper, is that they suck 7 kilograms of CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it neutralizes your flight on paper. And it's not that if you fly more, you do more good. No, you take away the negative of the flight. So this person really did not understand what was going on. And it was also a Marxist, of course, among those interviewed, that is bourgeois, to want to use the market to help improve the environment, right? But this is actually one of the good things about doing contingent valuation and about doing contingent choice. And you actually get the motivation of people why they give certain answers. And it's, of course, very amusing as well. So much for stated preference methods. Difficult. I hope I've made it clear. They're difficult to get right, but they're often the only way to estimate things that we care about. And therefore, we have to make use of these very problematic and controversial tools. And that's all for today.